Welcome to everyone. If you missed it, you may have recognized that I am not Mike, and I'm Kristin O'Planick, Market Systems Team Lead from USAID. And since Mike is one of our presenters today, we figured it wouldn't be fair to make him moderate as well, so I'm stepping in today. So welcome to this BEAM Grab the Mic webinar. What results did the market systems development approach deliver? A review of the latest evidence. So today we're going to look at the evidence review and talk a bit about how much impact did MSD programs have on poverty, how well did MSD programs do at promoting pro-poor growth and improved access to services, what kind of systemic change was achieved, and how can the evaluation of MSD programs be improved. In case you don't know, the BEAM Exchange is a platform for sharing knowledge and experiences related to market systems development globally. And BEAM is supported by the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, or the DCED. This is always a really exciting and revealing evidence review exercise. I think we learn a lot from doing this. For all of us working in market systems development, we continue to face the challenge of where's the evidence for this approach and that it works. I know I get that regularly from my leadership. So the review is an output of the Market Systems Development Working Group within the DCED, and we do this every couple of years for those of you that weren't aware. And this is connected to the evidence map that you'll find on the BEAM Exchange. So if you haven't reviewed that yet, it's worth getting on the site and taking a look at the evidence map in particular. And thanks to the World Bank for the funding that supports this. So with that, I will introduce our speakers. The presentation will be done by Mike Albu, who I think you all know as the director of the BEAM Exchange, and Lucio Osorio, a market systems development specialist who conducted this review as an independent consultant, but now is working with Mercy Corps, just to be clear. And then we will have some comments provided by Rachel Shah, a market systems specialist working as a senior consultant for the Springfield Center. I'm so excited to be here with you three. We will have roughly 40 minutes of presentation followed by Q&A. So as we go, please don't wait. You can go ahead and enter your questions right away in the Q&A feature. Please don't use the chat for questions because we won't be monitoring that in the same way. So go ahead and put them into the Q&A part at any time. And once we get to that portion of the presentation, we'll address as many as possible. And with that, I hand it over to you, Lucio.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Kristin, for your introduction. Let's see if I can move the slide forward. Okay, so in this section, can you hear me well? Kristin, can you confirm that you're hearing me well?
You sound great.
Okay, thank you. So in this section, I will give you a bit of background about what we reviewed and the main challenges faced by MSD evaluators. So this review is based on the study of approximately 130 documents that we submitted, that were submitted by 115 MSD practitioners and evaluators. The documents are mainly impact assessment, evaluation reports, and case studies that provided evidence of the impacts and cost effectiveness of MSD interventions. Then out of those 130 documents that we received, we selected 52 documents representing 36 programs. We selected them using the BEAM Exchange criteria. These documents were analyzed in detail and uploaded onto the BEAM Exchange evidence map. Out of those 36 programs that we selected, we focused on 14 that contained interesting examples to illustrate the nature of the results that the MSD approach can produce. So for a document to be selected for the review, it has to comply with the following criteria. It has to show connections between MSD interventions and some type of relevant impact Plus, it has to be in English language, produced after the year 2000, and be publicly available. Now, we can be more confident of the evidence if it describes clearly how the data was collected and analyzed. Also, if the research methods generated credible results, and if the findings are presented with a convincing logic. In terms of the geographic distribution, nothing has changed dramatically compared to the previous review. Basically, most of the evidence is coming from Africa and Asia, South Asia specifically, yeah. In terms of the sectoral focus, most of the evidence is coming from agriculture. Nothing really new there as well compared with the previous reviews, but I really found that the creativity of MSD programs in non-agricultural sectors was really quite impressive, both in terms of the intervention strategies and the research and evaluation methods. So I think there's lots to learn from that relatively small sample of programs. On this slide, we can see the donors that funded the programs we reviewed. And on this one, we can see the implementers that generated the evidence. Now let's move on to some of the challenges we found in terms of impact evaluation. Regarding independence, there are two key factors operating here. So the first one is that there is no clear consensus around fundamental concepts like market system, systemic change, sustainability, scale of impact, poverty, and resilience. And the second factor is that practically all MSD programs are quite large and complex. They cover vast regions, engage a wide range of market actors, and operate on many fronts at the same time. And these two factors combined make it really difficult to undertake strictly independent evaluations. What some teams are doing is to turn this apparent weakness into a strength. What they're doing is to establish collaborative relationships with the evaluators to discuss things like their theory of change, externalities affecting the program, and monitoring and evaluation methods. In a way, what we noticed is that the evaluators become part of the team. They of course, they try to behave in an independent way. They're trying to really work hard to keep their independence, but they're not just assessing whether a program produces a set of impacts, but can also contribute to those impacts through their inputs and their expertise. The second challenge is related to the fact that successful MSD programs have to adapt relatively quickly to changes in the market system. For example, we found programs changing the scope and focus of their strategies and shifting between subsectors, adjusting their theories of change, and modifying their indicators. In practice, this means that establishing stable baselines is practically impossible. I'm going to move really quickly through the last three challenges: selection bias, spillovers, and unintended effects. All of these challenges are well known, and they stem from the complex nature of market systems and MSD strategies used to promote diffusion of innovations, scale up, and crowding in. MSD programs really want or have to contaminate, or between brackets, of course, contaminate as much of the system as they can to succeed. And this makes it really hard to randomize samples and isolate control groups. Now I'm going to pass it over to Mike. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll let Mike move to his slides.
Thank you, Lucio. Okay, so I'm going to talk fairly briefly about the actual contents of the review in terms of the findings. And of course, I can't do justice to this document in 10 minutes, but I hope you're going to be kind of inspired to read the evidence review in more detail. It has a very short executive summary, by the way, so if you're short of time, there's a 3-page summary which will cover a lot of this detail. So the findings from the review are presented in, or the frontline findings are presented in 3 chapters, and these 3 chapters reflect the structure of the strategic framework, the sort of logical thinking for the market systems development approach, and you should probably be familiar with them here in this diagram. So essentially, we start in the review by looking at poverty reduction and the evidence for that, and then we go on to look at evidence for pro-poor growth or improved access to basic services, and then finally, the evidence for programs achieving market systems change. But I want to emphasize, although these are 3 chapters in the review, they're obviously intimately linked, because the whole point of the logic here is that it's interventions that are delivered by programs that create market system change, that generate pro-poor growth, and in turn, this leads to reduced poverty. So let's start at the top with the evidence for the poverty reduction. The unique selling point, the distinguishing feature of a market systems development approach is that we achieve scale, sustainability, and resilience. So let's look at scale first. We've got here headline increases in incomes and jobs by 10 programs that were reviewed. And as you can see, the scale of impact is quite impressive. It ranges from the tens to the hundreds of thousands of individual households being benefited, and the value of the benefits being gained by those poor people runs again from tens to, in a couple of cases, over $100 million. So undoubtedly, there's quite a large scale of impact from these kind of programs. But that's not really enough, is it? We also want to know whether these results can be sort of justified by the costs that are involved in producing them. So this is, this is about value for money, basically. Now that's quite a contentious topic, and it's not easy to make comparisons across very different and diverse programs. But this table shows 6 programs that, sorry, 1, 2, 3, there's more than 7, isn't it? Programs that reported the ratio of income benefits to costs, and you can see on the right-hand side that the average was $2.6 of benefit for every dollar that was spent. So there is clear evidence here that programs are capable of delivering large-scale impact cost effectively. Of course, people are also interested, understandably, in how those benefits are distributed, and particularly, whether they're distributed fairly, whether they're reaching marginalized groups, whether there's gender equity and social inclusion. Now, again, this is a very complicated area to assess and to compare programs across, but I wanted to show you this table because it has figures from 15 programs that we looked at, and you can see that if you take the number of women beneficiaries as a rather crude proxy for more generally for sort of social inclusion, you can see that the results achieved by programs, generally speaking, are in the range of 40 to 55%, although there's a couple of outliers there. So that gives you some sense of the inclusiveness of market systems development programs. Now, these tables are rather boring in my view. I mean, if you really want to get excited about this, and I am excited, you have to look at the case studies. And one of the things that Lucio did very helpfully in the review was he dived in some detail into 14 sort of individual programs and developed some sort of little cases around those programs and what they've achieved, either in terms of impact in poverty reduction terms, or in terms of the system change that those programs created. So I'm going to give you a few examples now, just as kind of appetizers to kind of encourage you to read the report in more detail. So let's start with this one, which is the Made in Nigeria program, which operated for 7 years in a deeply poor, highly fragile and conflict-affected Niger Delta region in Nigeria, and created sustained increases in income for over 300,000 farmers by developing better market systems for agricultural services and inputs. So it's a very, very interesting story. But what I wanted to look at in particular was the results, the quantified results. And what I want you to notice here is the particular pattern. This program, and this is typical for market development programs, it started quite slowly, but as it developed and over time, and particularly into its second phase, the impact, the outreach, the impact in terms of poverty reduction and the outreach in terms of numbers and yields accelerated rapidly. Now that is not, as I see, an accident. It is a feature of the way that market systems development programs work. And typically, where a conventional program might start spending money very fast and quickly and achieve impact and outreach quite fast in the cycle, MSD programs, as you can see on this graph, they start slowly and they build up. But the idea is that over time, because the results are generated by actors within the system, and because we're addressing underlying problems in that system and improving the overall functionality of the system, that impact will continue after the program ends, after the intervention ends at least. And you should be able to see that accelerated growth continuing beyond the end of the program itself, unlike conventional projects, which tend to sort of fade away, where the impact fades away once the project is completed. Now, let's have a look at another case. And this is, now we're not looking at poverty reduction, but we're looking at one layer down in the logic. We're looking here at growth, appropriate growth or access to services. And this is the case of sanitation services and the building of sanitation markets in Cambodia. And the SMSU program, which was the Sanitation Markets Scaling Up program in Cambodia, worked for 6 years on building up the markets for the supply of sanitation services, people who build latrines, service latrines, and market them to a wider population. And it contributed to very significant increases in latrine coverage and measurable health benefits in Cambodia, reaching over 1.5 million people. And again, this graph gives you the shape of that transformation that took place in access to latrine services across Cambodia. Now, what's really interesting about the market system development programs is how they achieve this kind of impact. What's different about them? And by the way, I mean, you may, if you're not familiar with it, there's a really good little 4-minute animated video on the Beam Exchange website which kind of goes through what's different about the market systems development approach. But I'm going to sum it up in one sentence here, which is MSD is about shifting the conditions that are holding problems in place. And the reason I like this diagram, which comes from an organization called FSG, is that it recognizes that these conditions that are holding problems in place, some of them are quite visible, explicit ones. They're about poor policies or inappropriate policies. They're about inadequate practices or resource flows that don't really reach the kind of people we want them to reach. But also the conditions may be deeper than that. So we can go, sometimes programs go under the surface and they look at things like relationships and connections, and they look at power dynamics. And even in some cases, they look at mental models that society has, maybe about, for example, the role of women in society or about the role of certain kind of ethnic groups. So these kind of, this framework, I think, is a great way of thinking about systems change. And what I'm going to do finally, because I'm wrapping up in a second, I'm going to give you 2 examples of market systems change that we saw in the review. So the first one comes from Ethiopia, the Hipster initiative, which was an initiative, an intervention of the Enterprise Partners program in Ethiopia. And it was working in the textile sector to build effective markets for industrial labor services. So we're talking about things like recruitment, job matching, skills development. And after piloting this in one particular industrial park, they were able to get this policy effectively adopted as a national policy by the government of Ethiopia for all industrial parks across Ethiopia. And as a result, by 2020, they reckon 30,000 workers had benefited from that model, and 87% of whom were women. The second case I want to just, this is my last slide, I'm going to just illustrate, it comes from Ghana, a program called MADE, also called MADE. And this was about establishing better practices and financing for agri-inputs and services through an outgrower model. And the program worked with a number of companies to develop this business model, this advanced outgrow model, helping them formalize planning, investment, contracting, input delivery, training, and the aggregation of produce. And again, as a result of that, they developed a set of practices which involved a sustainable service where there's now 500 farm enterprise advisors, sort of local entrepreneurs working across the northern region where this program was, servicing, supporting 136,000 farming households. So that's my offering to you today, and I do encourage you to go and read the report with all these other cases that illustrate these issues. Otherwise, I'm going to hand back to Lucio.
Thank you, Mike. That was great. Let me just share my screen again with you. Okay, let me just move forward. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 7 of the review, where we talk about some insights and reflections. I'm going to give you just a taster of the ones that are in black on the left box, so that I can talk in a bit more detail about the ones in red. Regarding the adoption of relevant indicators, we see a pattern of successful programs adding indicators on top of the ones that donors request from them, which in many cases do not detect structural changes in the market system. So the teams had to be creative and start looking for indicators that allow them to really look into those signals of structural change. On quasi-experimental methods, we saw that several programs are using them successfully, despite the inherent technical difficulties. These methods were used before the program started to promote dissemination of innovations and crowding in, which, as you can imagine, can affect comparisons between treatment and control groups. Regarding the use of complementary lenses, in order to address challenges like unintended effects, some programs used methods that combine complementary perspectives, such as outward in and inward out, intervention lens and helicopter lens, and also outcome harvesting, which is a tool that combines forwards and backwards perspectives. On portfolio reviews, they are not new, but what is new and interesting is that the frequency with which these reviews are being produced in the last couple of years and the diversity of donors investing in them are increasing. For example, between 2018 and now, we found very interesting portfolio reviews produced by CEDA, DFAT, the World Bank, and USAID. Before I go deeper into the other insights, it's important to note that there is still a lack of ex-post evaluations. We recognize the technical and administrative difficulties to carry them out, but also the importance of investing more in them. Perhaps not in all the MSD programs, but in some that could be considered by the broader field as important sources of knowledge. So now I'm going to move to the red items. I'd love to cover them all in detail, but there's no time. So in terms of MSD principles and practices, one of the clearest patterns that we saw in the documents reviewed is that the application of MSD principles and practices do matter, and really quite a lot, actually. And when I say MSD principles and practices, I'm talking about things like focusing on underlying causes rather than symptoms, having a vision of sustainable outcomes shaped by the interests of market actors, behaving as a facilitator that creates good conditions for the market actors to drive change from within and by themselves, rather than us driving that change, and embracing adaptive management. There were, by the way, this diagram is just a hypothetical diagram that I invented to convey the idea. It doesn't represent a particular program. There were MSD programs that for the first 2 or 3 years were not managing to achieve any meaningful changes in the behavior, engagement, and commitment of market actors. They were MSD programs on paper, really, but not in practice. What really changed things was the arrival of a new manager. Normally a single person who understood MSD well and could get their teams to live by these principles and practices. And that really created quite significant changes in team performance and also in the way in which the market actors engaged with the program. Now let's stay for a moment on this reflection about program performance and go into the competencies that were most frequently mentioned as key contributors to team performance. The most frequently mentioned competencies were related to building relationships with the market actors efficiently, with low transaction costs and low administrative costs. For example, streamlining grants and procurement solicitation procedures. In general, it was all about making it easy or easier for the market actors to establish contractual and collaborative relationships with the program. The other point is about learning quickly and sharing relevant knowledge with program teams, partners, and stakeholders. The third one is about conducting experimental pilot interventions using robust research methods. Now, we're not talking here about ad hoc experiments or haphazard trial and error. We're talking about well-designed experiments with clear hypotheses and methods. And this could apply to really simple things like testing the response of specific market actors or business managers to specific incentives from the program, down all the way to quasi-experimental methods and experiments. And the last one is about co-designing and coordinating interventions with key market actors. The teams really here, what happened was that they engage market actors as true partners, not just as organizations hired to deliver stuff. So that was really a key competence. Let's move on to the next one. This one is about another important insight that is related to the quality of the relationships between the implementing teams and the donors. And here the trends are really positive. Donors seem to be learning more and more about the unpredictable and complex nature of market systems and what this really entails for implementers in practice. As part of the review, we bumped into donor documents that explicitly promote adaptive management and a culture of experimentation. And they acknowledge as well the importance of investing more in the capacity of their own staff and recognize the need to move from a traditional sort of vertical donor recipient logic to one that is more horizontal of true partners and co-creators. I'm gonna leave you here for a few seconds with these quotes that, in my view, show really positive signals from the donors in terms of their thinking and discourse. Now let's move on. In terms of methodological clarity, a few things stand out from the review. First, there is a broad adoption of the MSD theory of change and the AAER framework proposed by the Springfield Center, as well as the DCD standard for result measurement. Regarding the standard, there was explicit recognition by some programs that it contributes to methodological clarity and improves the quality of the conversations, analysis, and learning within the team and between the team and the evaluators. Second point is that theory-based evaluation and mixed methods were the most commonly mentioned labels used to describe the evaluation approach. There was a gap between the labels and the practice. And that's related to the third point, which is that only 40% of the impact evaluations included a clear description of the research and evaluation methods used. Also, just a handful explained how their methods were combined to reinforce the validity of the results. And the rest did not describe the methodology at all, or did it in a superficial way. This is a long-standing issue that needs to be addressed, not only to improve the quality and credibility of the evidence, but also to accelerate the learning in our field across organizations. And now, let's move on to the last chapter of conclusions. The main one is that the MSD programs represented in the review are operating well and delivering impressive results for tens and even hundreds of thousands of people living in poverty and in very difficult, volatile and dysfunctional contexts. This is great, actually. For me, it was really impressive to see the scale and the terrain in which these programs operated or are operating. Regarding pro-poor growth, we could see positive and mutually reinforcing changes in business practices, shifts toward value addition mindsets, stronger networks and organizations, and policy changes, just to name a few. These changes have been detected thanks to the creativity of teams using indicators and methods that enable them to pick up early signals of structural change within the duration of the program. This was great as well to see this creativity taking place. But we also recognize that more ex-post evaluations are needed to be certain of the long-term effects of the programs, and also to learn more about what strategies are more effective at nurturing sustainable outcomes. The third bullet point, MSD programs are facilitating systemic change, but one gap we noticed is that there is less evidence on programs explicitly addressing power relationships within market systems, or tackling the underlying social attitudes and mental models that often sustain systemic dysfunction. Regarding competencies, we could infer from the evidence reviewed that good MSD principles and practices are being increasingly adopted and refined. This includes a convergence in monitoring and evaluation practices that is helping the teams to better detect and understand systemic change, though there is still ample room for improvement and innovation here, which I personally find quite exciting. So really a very positive picture with some gaps and room for improvement, but it was a really, really exciting process for me to see what's going on in the field and seeing all of this creativity and innovation. Thank you for listening. I'm going to pass it over to Rachel now. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucio and Mike, for that really interesting presentation, for all the work that you've done on reviewing the evidence. It's really important for the field, obviously. I can see that there's a lot of reflections coming up in the chat and in the questions, so I'll try to keep my comments brief. Lucio and Mike just invited me to give a couple of reflections from somebody who wasn't involved with the evidence review, just to kind of highlight some of the things that stood out to me. So I think some of the things that I thought when I was reading the review and listening to the presentation are very similar to what's coming up in the chat and questions. So as I say, I'll try to keep it brief. Firstly, there's obviously some really encouraging trends emerging. It's great to hear that the knowledge and experience that comes from both funding and implementing the approach is accumulating. And this seems to be having a really positive effect. And hopefully this will mean that the approach is becoming more effective over time, and especially more cost effective over time as we learn what works in different contexts and sectors. So that's great news. I think with that encouragement, there comes a bit of a caution, and it came up in the introduction, it came up in the later presentations, and it's come up in the chat and in the questions too. And that's with growing evidence that the MSD theory of change really works, there are also incentives to call something MSD that isn't really applying MSD principles. So Lucio, like your slide showed, you know, when the MSD principles are kind of really applied, you noticed in some of the documents you reviewed a real change in results, but those programs would have been labeled MSD kind of throughout that period. And you really highlight in the review, and I would encourage people to go and read the whole thing, you know, really highlight some of the key principles of MSD and especially some of the key success factors that came out of the evidence review for getting the kind of results that you're encouraged by. And I think this is a really, really important point. It obviously presents a challenge for BEAM, because just because something is called MSD, it doesn't mean that it is applying MSD principles. And likewise, just because something's not called MSD, it doesn't mean it's not applying MSD principles. And so reviewing the evidence of whether those principles work becomes very challenging, as you've rightly highlighted. But I also think it presents a challenge for the rest of us, for those of us involved in program design, especially, to really think critically and look at those success factors around competencies, around relationship between donor and implementer, and around those key principles being applied well on, okay, if we want these successes, if we want the trend to go in the direction that's been highlighted here over time, then whether or not we call it MSD, the critical thing is applying those principles. So that was a massive takeaway for me. I was also really interested, as somebody who's been involved in measurement over the years, really interested in some of this reflections around how we collect evidence about MSD program results. And there's lots of questions about that are coming up. So I'll leave time for you guys to address those. But one thing I wanted to highlight is that the review really emphasizes the need for more empirical evidence about sustainability. And I think this is both encouraging and a bit of a call for action to the field. It's really exciting to see more and more people are investing in ex post assessments, empirical assessments of how sustainable the results from MSD programming are post-closure, post-intervention closure. And some of you have rightly raised in the chat, you know, it's great that the trend is going like this, but what happens after the program closes? And the review rightly calls out that we don't yet have enough evidence on that, and also highlights some of the work that is being done to address that. And Kristin can speak to this, I can speak to this, there's others who are working in this area, that there is more and more work being done to build that empirical evidence base, but it really should be the norm in the field, given that one of our biggest claims is that MSD will lead to more sustainable impact. So great to see the review really highlighting that as well. One thing I wanted to push back on a little bit, or at least ask a question about, is it wasn't really in the presentation, but it kind of touched on it and it came up again in the questions. And then there's quite a lot about it in the written review, which is around whether or not the approach lends itself to the poorest of the poor, or to more marginalized groups. Talked a little bit about women, potentially the more marginalized group in lots of contexts. And I would argue, and I have always argued, that it's not that the approach doesn't lend itself to this, but it's how the approach is used, and that really targeting sector selection, market system analysis, intervention design, facilitation to those groups, and really monitoring and measuring results isn't done as much as it could be done. But that if it was, you know, if incentives and capacities were really looking at those target groups, that it could be very effective, and that there are cases of that, you know, particularly in sanitation, hygiene, to some extent in some other health sectors. So just curious to hear your thoughts on that. You know, would you say that the evidence suggests otherwise, or would you say that it's really about how the approach is used if you're looking at more marginalized groups than that kind of 20 to 60% of the poorest?
Thank you, Rachel. Should I address that one? Would you like me to talk about that one?
Yes, go for it. Go for it.
Okay. So about that last point you made and your pushback, I think when you look at that quote in the document, what it's really talking about is about the fact that in MSD programs, we tend to have less control in terms of where our interventions are going to end up, who our interventions are going to end up benefiting, because we have to work through market actors, we have to work through the businesses, we have to work through government agencies. So they also have certain interests to go and engage with specific target groups, right? So for some of them, even if we wanted to benefit people living in extreme poverty in a certain region, for a business, it might not make business sense to do that. So we lose control there compared to direct delivery programs or humanitarian aid programs that are really going directly to those target groups that need the help. And we do that directly. In this case, is because we work indirectly through the market actors. But I think there's another point to that issue, and it's the fact that I think when we're trying to the exciting field of the exciting parts of MSD are where we're trying to stretch it to its point of breakdown. We want to, some practitioners are trying to stretch the approach to see how much we can use it to really reach very difficult targets in very difficult geographies, in very dysfunctional and thin markets. People living in extreme poverty with low levels of literacy. This is where, and also in subsectors that are dominated by the idea of public goods, like water and sanitation and education and energy access. So there, I think what needs to happen is that we need to get creative and enhance the approach, improve it and strengthen it with interventions that go beyond the pure economic transaction and self-profit motivations. So you start to see programs experimenting with cash transfers, graduation approaches, engaging with market actors that are not necessarily business actors, but are grassroots organizations and things like that. So I think that the approach, we will be able to make the approach produce impacts in those groups, but we're still learning how to do that. There's a lot of room there for creativity and innovation.
It seems like there's a need for kind of pushing beyond. So I guess over the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of emphasis on the private sector and commercial and financial incentives, but the approach itself is really just about permanent market actors and their incentives and capacities. So it's about maybe finding different market actors, whether or not it's private sector. Some will be private sector, some won't be private sector, but really, I mean, you're right that we lose control because we're not delivering directly, but there's still a case of doing that rigorous analysis to say, well, what are the incentives and capacities here to benefit these more marginalized groups, and that, do those really exist in the sectors that we're looking at? And I think there are some exciting examples of people applying the approach and saying, yeah, they absolutely do exist. It's just not in the traditional sort of profit-making space. So yeah, excited to see what happens in the future. I've got some sort of thoughts and questions around impacts and income increases and broader impacts, but I'm also seeing the time. I'm wondering if this would be a good time to leave that to the side and actually let's hear. There's some really lively discussion happening among participants, so let's go to that, I think.
Sure, great, thanks, Rachel. And I think given that there are so many questions and there's still a lot to cover, we will plan to run over a bit. So if those of you that don't need to run to another meeting immediately after this, stick with us and we'll give it a few extra minutes. There's a question from Anna that's pretty brass tacks here, that she would love to hear more about some of the relevant indicators programs adopted that stood out to you on the structural side. I don't know, Mike or Lucio, can one of you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. There were some indicators. I remember ABC Bangladesh, for example, used was quite innovative in terms of the this was a Feed the Future funded program, and they added indicators related to they call them, they had fancy names for them, but basically, and also I just remember MDF, Market Development Facility, which is a multi-regional program operating in Asia. They were very creative in terms of both the indicators and the tools they used to help the teams keep an eye on how those indicators were evolving. I'm thinking about, for example, the mentality, the changes in mentality around value addition, how much both producers and buyers were moving into a mentality of where they started valuing more the quality of the products and the diversity of products. They also looked into repeated sales. They looked into changes in the strategies of the market actors, or a few key market actors. Yeah, I would have to look into the examples again, but I can point you in the direction of at least those two programs that call really my attention, MDF and AVC, and they were pretty impressive actually. I don't know, Mike, if you remember other indicators there.
No, I don't want to add to that now. Let's move on to.
Sure. So we've got a couple questions getting at how much can we trust some of this, right? So one of these questions here from Gail, attribution of ultimate outcomes and impact to the MSD program is inherently difficult. As we know, the program is only a contributor to a complex change process, and reporting is highly influenced by the targets set with the funder. Can we really trust these impact figures and make these cost-benefit ratios? There's a related question also about the credibility of the cost-benefit analysis related to the challenges, especially at the farmer level, of understanding income and profit trends. And the approach for calculating costs can vary significantly. And then one more related question to throw it into this pile here. When thinking about value for money, there's also the accounting for the large amount of investment that the market actors contribute into this, and that's probably not being counted in these ratios. So would be really interested in thoughts across the board in this kind of grouping of questions.
Well, Kristin, that's like a week-long webinar in itself, I think. These are really tricky questions. I tried to say when I presented that slide that there's a lot of caveats, and we need to be very cautious about these kind of figures. I think one needs to be pretty damn cautious about any kind of cost-benefit analysis, to be honest. I mean, it was a hugely popular approach to development impact, assessing development impact in the 1970s, and it went completely out of fashion for 30 years because it was largely found not to work. So I think it's a tool, and it's helpful to understand. It's helpful to look at these ratios, and sometimes it's helpful to give some credibility to the approach. But really, you have to look in more detail at what's really going on. And for me personally, what's the whole point about market systems approach, or any kind of systems approach, is you're looking at the capacity to make underlying changes that are shifting conditions in systems. And how those numbers that pop up in the table, they depend on all kinds of factors, like when you do the evaluation, which costs and benefits you include and which you don't, as you just pointed out. How do you factor in the investment made by firms? I suppose I honestly wonder whether this kind of interrogation of the data actually adds any value to the question of how do we do programs better. I think that Lucia mentioned that many of these programs are using the DCD standard for results measurement, which is a very systematic way of thinking about evidencing the causal links in the results chain that lead from interventions to to changes in poverty. So I think that's a very important part of the credibility for this evidence base in many cases. And Lucia may remember how many of the programs are adopting the DCD standard. But I think when it comes to these bigger questions about, well, what value for money, I don't think the DCD standard really helped us there. And as I say, I think we could get a bunch of experts around the table to talk about value for money and the intricacies of measuring it for weeks, and we may not get to a resolution. But by all means, if you're interested in that topic and you think it helps us do development better, I would be happy to hear from people who are more expert about it than I am.
Yeah, I seem to remember, Mike, that there are about 16 programs out of the 32 that are using the DCD standard. I think for me, this issue of attribution and contribution, I think we need to see, it's clearer when you look at the changes in behavior and business strategies and the perceptions of the actors with which the program is directly engaging. And there are plenty of examples in the evidence review that there were changes in business models, in perceptions about the importance of improved seeds, or changes in the behavior of how to use pesticides, or the perception about the importance of sanitation and having a latrine in your home. All of those things happened clearly because of the interventions of the program. And it was clear as well that many of these players started to expand their operations because of the interventions and advice of the program. So I think then moving on to broader impacts on aspects of the market system that are further away from our interventions, it's more tricky, but there were still some examples there of changes in policies, for example, that had impacts on our target population. So that for me was very positive. And in terms of, just very briefly, in terms of value for money and the response from the market actors, especially the businesses, in terms of how much they invested as a result of our interventions, I tried to look at patterns across the programs around that specifically. And of course, it's very hard to establish a pattern there, but I did see several programs that had a ratio of investment by the private sector compared to investment by the program that range between 1.3 and 3.3. So that was a really interesting thing, and probably deserves a little bit more of attention in terms of the research, future research, because that could be an indicator that could compare across programs, but still early stages.
Right, and I would just throw out that would be highly variable between sector. I mean, thinking about some of the things we're working on right now, we can get leverage ratios in the energy sector of 30-to-1, but that's not going to be true across the board. So drawing those comparisons is tricky too. There are also a few questions around the idea of what you saw in this review in terms of programs really seeming to be targeting structural changes versus the behavioral ones, and to what extent you saw in the body of evidence discussion about this kind of the relationships between actors and the way that really motivated and supported change. So there's a few questions that kind of get at that idea of the behavioral relational side rather than some of these structural shifts that people are pointing to in this evidence.
That's a very good question. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, I mean, in terms of how the many case studies are presented in the review, I think some of them have emphasized structural issues, but I think if you look under the surface of most of those structural changes, you'll find relational changes as well. They may not have been emphasized in the way those little mini cases are written out, but just to take an example, or let me think of an example. I mean, in the case of the Made Nigeria work, that you could argue that a change, a new business, or in the case of the Ghana Made work, you could argue that this is a structural change because what you're seeing is a new business model being applied. But that business model only works because of a shift in the way that businesses understand farmers' needs and are willing to engage with them. And it's a whole change in attitudes around who constitutes a profitable customer to reach out to, whether women are or poor people in ethnic minorities constitute a viable business proposition. These changes in attitudes, or indeed whether in fact the idea that one should invest in poor farmers as a commercial proposition rather than as a sort of charitable proposition. I mean, these are kind of issues to do with relationships and values and mental models, and I think you find elements of that throughout the cases that's going on. It doesn't mean that programs set out explicitly with that as their primary objective, because often that's not what gets written in the project proposal or in the log frame. But actually, if you look under the surface at what's really going on when you see these systems change, that's actually often fundamental to the sort of the resilience of the change, if you like.
Great. We're really quickly, I see some people are dropping out because we're at the hour. Please go ahead and do the short feedback form. The link is in the chat. We're going to keep discussing for a little bit longer since as long as folks hang on, there's still a lot of questions and interest, I think. But if you do have to drop, please go ahead and do the feedback now. Lucio, did you have more to add on that?
No, I just wanted to counter argue that question of sort of, the question seemed to draw a distinction between structural change and behavioral change. And for me, they're not different. Behavioral change is one of the deepest structural changes that you can have in an MSD program. So I think the key here is the scale of that behavior change. If just a few farmers are changing their farming practices or how they use pesticides, for example, you can't really say that that's structural change. But as you start seeing that behavior is spreading throughout a larger population, then you could argue that you're doing a good job in terms of structural change. So the question there is, what is that sort of critical mass of people that you need to change their behavior to consider that a structural change? In my view, and this is still something that I've been just thinking about on paper, is I think the critical mass is when that behavior change starts to affect the behavior of other actors and the rest of the system starts to respond to that new behavior. So for example, these farmers using better practices or using improved seeds, that generates a response from seed providers. Then you start seeing that there are interlocking or interdependent changes in the system that are starting to happen because of that behavior change. Then that's a sort of early signal of structural change. But again, that could give us room for another webinar.
I just chip it in case people are getting confused about terminology, but I think the question was in relation to this framework which I offered, where structural change is kind of what you see at the surface, but it's the transformation. The question is what is transformational change?
Yeah.
But as I say, I think we've both said the same thing really, which is that as you go deeper under the surface, you do see these changes in relationships and connections in these cases that we looked at. Although, as you pointed out very importantly, Lucio, not much of the evidence talks about changes in power dynamics. And that is something that was a bit of a gap. So it'd be great to see more on that.
Great. We have a question from Marika to you, Lucio. You had made a comment about evaluators becoming team members. Can you elaborate on that and how it works in reality?
Yeah. I have to be honest, the reports, the documents that I reviewed did not really share the intimacies of that, how that relationship took place. But from what I have seen with the experience in previous programs and what I've heard from colleagues, is basically that there is compared to a relationship where you have an evaluator just coming in, looking at documents, looking at the data, and assessing whether an impact has been achieved or not, which is the sort of more traditional type of evaluation. Here, what we have is an evaluator that comes in with a position of independence and a sort of semi-detached in terms of the way he or she perceives the program, but interacting regularly with the team, having lots of discussions about trying to understand what are the complexities of the program, what are the different moving parts, what are the theories of change that the program is using. Curiously, in some cases, the programs didn't have any theory of change until the evaluator arrived, and then they built a theory of change sort of in retrospect. Those sort of exercises and sort of a relationship of coaching starts to emerge, where the evaluator is asking difficult questions and giving a little bit of tough love, trying to help the team to ask the right questions and look at different ways, have different perspectives to look at the data, that sort of thing. So it's about sort of that development of a more ongoing, a closer relationship that has really helped some of the programs, and that is a recommendation that some programs have made.
Great.
Yeah, if I could add, Kristin, I mean, some programs and some donors have explicitly tried to create this longer term relationship through longitudinal evaluations, where the evaluation team is contracted right from the beginning of the program, so that it works alongside the program to develop a theory of change, to develop indicators, and to really understand and be sort of embedded in the nature of the program itself. And that has created controversy sometimes in terms of how independent they then are, but it is undoubtedly the case that effective evaluations have something like that, or they do it retrospectively, where they really, as Lucia was just saying, where the programs is given the space to engage the evaluator in really deeply understanding their thinking and their approach before the evaluator begins analysing the data.
Great. So there's a question here that is related to the evidence view, but also just kind of the inventory on beam exchange of the MSD programs, and that only 25% of them are still active. So do you feel like from this review, you have a sense that MSD is waning as a development paradigm? Or, you know, I don't know, just in terms of looking at evidence view, if there's a way to draw a conclusion around that. I know, Lucio, you mentioned the portfolio reviews were positive.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the evidence review per se gives us much of addresses that question, because it was just looking at what the evidence is there. I mean, I have a view on that more generally as the director of the beam exchange, and more importantly as the person who supports the market systems development working group in the DCED. And I think there is an argument to be saying that the MSD is, as an explicit approach, is waning. I mean, but certainly some donors that were very, very much behind it and supported it in the past are less explicit about it as a label applied to program designs. However, it's also the case that I think the principles of a systems approach and a systems approach applied to markets is becoming more and more pervasive. And although so it's cropping up, I mean, all kinds of organizations and donors that previously had no kind of glimmer of understanding of market systems or systems approaches are now beginning to think about systems approaches and adopt systems approaches with varying degrees of explicit or implicit recognition. And so within the working group, as you know, Kristin, you know, we hear conversations from donors like FAO, like ILO, like the European Commission, who are very excited about thinking systemically. Whether they call it MSD is another matter, but these things are being tried, and they're being tried and experimented with and kind of infiltrating their way into all kinds of program designs outside the usual areas of agriculture that we're familiar with. And so they're cropping up in other sectors as well. So I am sort of, on the one hand, I'm obviously sort of disappointed that, well, although it's normal to see, the waxing and waning of development fashions, that MSD or M4P is sort of waning as a label. But on the other hand, I'm very encouraged that I'm seeing it cropping up in all kinds of a much wider range of organizations taking an interest. And that does create problems for me in the Beam Exchange, because we have to decide whether to include a particular project in the index, for example. And it's really tricky now, because often it's difficult to say, well, is it sufficiently? I don't want to open the floodgates and call every program that uses a systems approach MSD, because I think that would devalue the label. But my emotion in relation to all of that is one of encouragement, Julian, rather than despair, definitely.
Great. Yeah, and I can only speak from the USAID side, but we continue in every new policy and strategy document that comes out. I only see elevation of systems approaches at this point. So very much resonating with what Mike just said, and definitely within the working group. I feel like every meeting when there's a new donor at the table. So it's very promising.
There's also, just really briefly, there's also a very practical reason why you see less ongoing programs in the review, is that for basically most programs that generate evaluation reports have finished. We did pick up some midline evaluations, but most of them have finished. There's plenty, as far from my perspective, there's plenty of MSD programs ongoing, and I see lots of donors investing more and more. That's a very intuitive perception, but I don't think that the MSD approach is waning. That's my perception. I do agree with Mike about the pervasiveness of some of the principles of MSD, but I think the MSD label is still strong.
All right, I appreciate we are now pretty well over time. So I'm gonna package a couple of questions here to try to wrap up a few things. There were so many questions about ex post, but I think Rachel did speak to that a fair amount. I don't know that we have a lot more to say on that. I know that both USAID and SDC are planning some more ex posts coming up. So, we are trying. It is hard. I can't really explain why.
Well.
And let's see. So here's a couple questions if you have comments. So do you see any evidence around the length of MSD programs as related to their success? And whether programs with longer life cycles tackle behavioral changes in comparison with shorter programs, kind of getting deeper in that inverted pyramid. And another question, which I think is interesting, if any of these reviews were really recent, to what extent did COVID show up in any of the evidence? Because I think that's always a hot topic in these times. So if there's a comment on any of those, I think that might be a nice final round of questions.
So in terms of duration, it's always hard to tell. I think there's always, when you look at the programs we reviewed, you find programs that have been going for 10, 12 years, others that have been going for 2-3 years. I think there's a sweet spot where you have enough time to build trust with the market actors and detect changes, detect signals of structural change, but not too long that the program can become complacent. I think that there's a sweet spot there, and I'm not going to say anything exciting, but I do think it's around 5 to 8, 9 years. I don't know, something like that. But if you as a team think that you're going to have 15 years in the field to do stuff, I think that distorts the mentality of the team. And but I have seen programs that really, when they apply the MSD principles and they have an appropriate set of indicators and monitoring methods, the teams can detect really important changes in a couple of years. And do you want me to talk about COVID, Mike, or you want to take that one?
I'm happy if you've got something to say. Yeah, go for it.
I did see a few reports talking explicitly about COVID. I don't have the figures in my head, but I seem to remember it was about 3 or 4 programs that talked about COVID.
Great. And now, as we close, I'll take moderator's privilege and reminder, please do the feedback survey. The link is in the chat. But I would like each of you, just if you could point, what is an evidence gap you would like people to pay attention to? For those of us that are funding these evaluations, for those of us that are implementing and designing these evaluations, where should we focus that would be most meaningful given what you've seen?
I wasn't prepared for that one. Mike, do you have any ideas if you want me?
I would still say, I mean, Kristin's, you didn't mention, but there's actually, you've just recently published your ex-post evaluation of the Uganda CPM program, and that's great, but it's not enough. We still lack these ex-post evaluations, and they don't need to be broad reaching, but they could focus on particular issues, but we definitely need, as someone asked a question, we need to, it's not enough just to show that curve shooting up. We need to prove that the momentum continues beyond the end of the program.
And I think that evidence should be a public good. And I would just throw out there the proposal that I think the donor community should have like a fund to do ex-post evaluations that belong to humanity, and focusing really on really strategic, very interesting, innovative programs, as I said in my presentation before. I would say, I think we touched upon those evidence gaps in the presentation. I would go back to that. I think the whole area of power relationships, power dynamics is important. The whole sort of more psychological domain on what are the impacts of our interventions on self-esteem, self-perception, cognitive awareness and things like that. That would be really exciting to dig deeper into.
Rachel? Sorry, did you say Rachel?
Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I fully agree with Mike. I think I'm actually with both of you. I agree on the power relations as well. I think the two things that I'm really advocating for at the moment are more ex post, because this is the thing that we're claiming, is that it's more sustainable. And then this one is a little bit harder to kind of capture, I think, but more around the wider sort of transformational impacts. I think there was a question around, how much does this really benefit each individual? And I would like to see more evidence on like what, zooming right out, like what is MSD doing for people's lives who are suffering, marginalized, living in poverty? And I think that some of these sort of aggregated kind of, private sector investment X amount or whatever can lose sight of that. So those are the two areas that I'd love to see more evidence on.
All right. Thank you so much for those of you that held on until now. Clearly, this is a very hot topic, and I think we all could spend hours discussing much more in depth. I do highly encourage you to read the review. It's quite readable, and so don't be intimidated by diving in. And please, again, do our short feedback survey. And I hope to see you at the next Grab the Mic webinar. Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.